I am going to talk about ArcGIS Enterprise and introducing the product. Why did we make the name change? I'll talk about some of the other capabilities of ArcGIS Enterprise that you may not necessarily have heard of before, or maybe you don't associate with ArcGIS Enterprise. But just to do introductions first, my name is Philip Heede. I'm the lead product manager for ArcGIS Enterprise. Sitting down here in front, hiding out, Shannon, stand up. Shannon, also a product manager on the ArcGIS Enterprise team. So after the presentation, if you have any questions you don't want to ask to the full room, feel free to come up and ask both Shannon and myself questions. All right, before I start the presentation, I always like to do a little bit of a survey of the room, just to get a feel for the crowd here. We're at the Developer Summit, right? So I'm going to make an assumption that most, if not all of you, are developers of some kind. But in the area of technical people, do you consider yourself software developers or IT administrators, or maybe both? Software developers. All right, we are at the Developer Summit. That's good. IT administrators, maybe some DevOps type stuff. Okay. And a mix of both. Very good. Excellent. All right. So I'm also going to assume that most of you are ArcGIS Server users today. ArcGIS 4 Server. Let's drop the 4 at this point. I saw some nods. How many of you have moved to 10.5? Excellent. Rock on. 2 months. Very good. How many of you are on 10.4, 10.4x? Another very good portion. 10.3x? 10.2? All right, now it starts getting interesting. 10.1. Couple. Any 10.0s? We should talk. 9x. All right. Sir, please come up after the presentation. All right, enough joking around. So, when we talk about ArcGIS Enterprise, I want to take a step back first and look at the overall ArcGIS platform that we, Esri, provide these days. We've been talking about the concept of a WebGIS for a number of years. I'm sure many, if not most of you, have already heard of that idea. We have 2 products that make that vision, that pattern of implementing a GIS come to life. There's ArcGIS Online, which is the SaaS offering, the software as a service. Runs in the cloud, managed by us. You don't have to install anything. And then there's the software. ArcGIS Enterprise is now the product that represents that side of the equation. This is where you get software that you download from us, or we send you DVDs. Yes, that still happens. You install it in your own infrastructure. You maintain it. You could decide when you upgrade or not upgrade. Sir. And the 2 products have very similar functionality at what we call the core functionality level. You have the ability to publish feature services. You have the ability to create web maps, layers, consume those different items in all of your different applications. The applications that you create with APIs and SDKs, and as well as the applications that come with the platform itself. Once we start looking in and digging a little bit deeper, of course there are differences. So what I'm going to talk about here for the next 55 minutes or so is, of course, the software version of this. ArcGIS Enterprise has a lot of WebGIS capabilities that are common between Enterprise and Online, and then a lot of additional advanced capabilities that are only found within the software model. So let's talk about what those capabilities are. Of course, ArcGIS Enterprise has great mapping and visualization capabilities. You have the full power of the desktop to author all of your maps using rich cartography, publish that out as map services, and draw things that you can't do anywhere else. As you heard and saw this morning, ArcGIS Enterprise has very strong analytical capabilities. We've had the geoprocessing framework for many, many years with hundreds and hundreds of tools. And now with ArcGIS Enterprise 10.5, we've added GeoAnalytics and raster analytics to the mix. ArcGIS Enterprise, of course, can do geocoding, whether it's geocoding using your own data, locators that you've put together, or data that you've sourced from us, or maybe you represent a company that have data that you sell to other customers. Wherever your data is coming from, you can publish that out and make available as geocoding services to be consumed by a great number of applications. The same thing holds for routing. Whether you have your own network data sets, you acquire commercial data through us, or you supply to your customers, ArcGIS Enterprise, through the network analyst capabilities, can do routing, optimizations, and much more. ArcGIS Enterprise also comes with access to the Living Atlas. You saw the Living Atlas this morning in the context of ArcGIS Online. But just because you install the software in your infrastructure doesn't mean that you're cut off from all that content. You can still get access to it. If you're installing the software in a connected environment, meaning you have access to the open internet, you have access to the full suite of Living Atlas content just like you would through an ArcGIS Online implementation. If you're behind the firewall, disconnected from the open internet, we also have data that you can download, with more coming on the way. Of course, ArcGIS Enterprise comes with all the app templates you saw this morning. It's not just about web services. It's about making those web services come to life through layers and maps and apps that you create using templates, the app builders, or, of course, complete custom applications written using the APIs and SDKs that we've seen demonstrated. ArcGIS Enterprise is also a 3D capable platform. You can take all of your 3D meshes, your multi-patch data, make it available to the open web, consume it in all of those same different applications. The scene viewer that's built into the product, or now with the Runtime 100, your own applications as well. In other words, ArcGIS Enterprise is everything that ArcGIS Server ever was and much more. It's not just the server. It's the server plus the application infrastructure that you can build upon, so you have an easier time making your applications do the things you want them to, instead of having to reinvent the wheel and build your own application infrastructure over and over again. When we look at ArcGIS Enterprise, well, it's software. So it consists of a number of different components. One of those components is ArcGIS Server. ArcGIS Server has not gone anywhere. How many of you came into the presentation wondering, why did they change the name and what happened to my server? A couple of people. It is still there. ArcGIS Server is a core component of Enterprise. It's the engine that powers everything behind the hood. It is just like it was, plus a lot of new capabilities. Another core component of ArcGIS Enterprise is Portal for ArcGIS. This has been around for a while, but with ArcGIS Enterprise, what we're saying is this is a key component of any deployment of the product, because it's where we are pouring all of our development efforts into building upon the full suite of software components and not just piecemeal. And then, of course, ArcGIS Enterprise has places or software components that make up places where we can store data within the system. When you hand over data to us through one mechanism or the other, we need a place to store it, and we have software components to take care of that. And of course, to make it possible to integrate with security of different kind and make the entire suite of software components available to web clients, we have the web adapter. Now, those of you who are working with 10.3 or higher, you'll notice that all of these components predate 10.5. All of these components are the same components, you know them from before. What we're saying is they're all important. This is not just about the standalone server, because while most of you in this room may speak REST or JSON, the rest of the world does not. They need applications to go on top of those web services. And the full product provides that application infrastructure that you can build upon. Now, it's funny. Usually when I do presentations, I say, well, ordinary human beings don't speak REST and JSON. All of you are like, of course I do. It's good. My kind of crowd. I'm a form developer myself. Another new thing that happened with 10.5, and this is going to be of interest especially to the IT administrators in the room, is the introduction of this notion of server licensing roles, or just server roles for short. This is essentially us making some changes to the licensing model of ArcGIS Enterprise to better align our recommendations around best practices for workload separation with how the product is actually licensed itself. So I mentioned ArcGIS Server is, of course, still in the mix. ArcGIS Server now has essentially 5 different roles it can take, depending on what license you apply to it. There's one software component that you download and install, and then when you apply a license to it, a server role, it gains a purpose in life. Jay talked here in the plenary about purpose-built servers. This is what he was referring to. The first server role is just the GIS server. So for the vast majority of you, this will likely be what you simply think of as traditional ArcGIS server capabilities. Map services, feature services, geoprocessing services, routing if you have network analysts, and so on and so forth. The next server role is image server. This used to be image extension for server. Now it's a server role by itself. And that may sound a little bit like an arcane detail, but it has a big impact on how you can license the product and deploy it in your own infrastructure in a way that I think makes a lot more sense for the modern age. The same thing happened with GeoEvent. From being GeoEvent extension for server, it's now simply GeoEvent server. New with 10.5 is GeoAnalytics server. You saw that demonstrated here not too long ago. This is about taking large amounts of vector and tabular data and quickly processing it using modern distributed computing mechanisms. And finally, last but not least, new with 10.5 is the introduction of the modern business analyst server. This is everything business analyst was in the past, plus the modern business analyst web app that you may know from Business Analyst Online. Now you can take that and deploy within your own infrastructure behind the firewall, so you can gain access to the full geo-enrichment capabilities and demographic data that comes with BA. So when we look at the 4 different software components of ArcGIS Enterprise, we put them together in what we are beginning with 10.5 referring to as the base deployment, or the base ArcGIS Enterprise deployment. Instead of talking about those standalone servers and connecting them in different ways, what the base deployment represents is the minimal architecture of the system that all of Esri's applications, as well as your modern applications built on our newer APIs and SDKs, require as the basic infrastructure. The base deployment gives you all the same capabilities that you know from ArcGIS Online, plus all of the capabilities of the GIS server. In other words, the traditional ArcGIS server functionality that you're already familiar with. This is what provides that application infrastructure with web maps, identities, authorization, and access control that you can build upon, so you don't have to invent that from scratch. So ArcGIS Enterprise provides the ability to set up what we call a WebGIS in your own infrastructure. And the base ArcGIS Enterprise deployment is the pattern of which to put together the different software components to make the product work the way it's intended to. This is us being much more prescriptive, beginning with 10.5, about what you need to install to make full use of the system. Beginning with 10.3, you probably saw the introduction of Portal for ArcGIS. And many of you asked, do I need to install a portal? Do I not need to install a portal? And those were good questions for the time. What I'm telling you now is, beginning with ArcGIS Enterprise 10.5, I very much encourage you to do that. That is the pattern of the future that we're building upon. When you look at the base deployment, you can, of course, install all the software components on a single machine, on multiple machines, and, of course, do highly available setups. ArcGIS Enterprise and all the software components within it have a very, very flexible deployment model. You can install it anywhere that you have access to install software that, on systems that meet our system requirements. That can be on premises. Oftentimes, you hear ArcGIS Online being referred to as the cloud and ArcGIS Enterprise being on premises. That makes me flinch, because that's not all it is. ArcGIS Enterprise can be installed on premises, of course, in your basement, under your desk, hopefully not under your desk, in a data center, in a private cloud, but of course also the public cloud. In fact, one of the environments that it's easiest to install the software in is the public cloud today. You don't have to go click next, next, next in a bunch of installers and do manual configuration. We have tooling that can do all of that for you, particularly in the public cloud. And whether you need to meet strict SLAs with high availability, or you just want to set up a simple, small dev and test system for your own use, you can, of course, do those things. So let's take a quick look at some of the server roles and what they stand for. What are the capabilities that come with those different server roles? Now, the GIS server, as I mentioned, is that traditional ArcGIS server functionality that you're all familiar with. It's the server role that provides visualization, analytics, editing capabilities of traditional GIS data sources, such as vector and tabular data. All of that being made available through REST-based web services, whether they're the Esri-based services or OGC standards compliant services, such as WMS, WFS, and many, many more. A key part of the GIS server is the ability to publish services and share maps and layers from your own business databases. In other words, traditional enterprise geodatabases or other types of data sources that you attach to the system. Data sources that are not managed by ArcGIS, but you have your DBAs take care of Oracle and SQL Server and whatnot. Maybe it's shape files in a file share. I'm not judging much. This is a key differentiator for the software compared to the SaaS model. ArcGIS Online does not run within your own infrastructure, which means it cannot connect out to those databases and file shares. As I mentioned, the GIS server is what powers all of those map services and feature services and beyond. What I want you to all notice is some of the changing vocabulary as well, as we're moving from speaking solely about services to a higher level abstraction, the web layers. I have a tendency to think in terms of publishing dynamic map services. The pro team would really like for me to talk about sharing map image layers, and that's okay too, as long as we can all figure out the vocabulary and talk together. As developers, you're often working directly at the service layer. But a key part of this change to the WebGIS pattern is also understanding what the layer on top can do for you. You have a lot more flexibility to do configuration of web layers instead of having to publish entirely new services. So within your applications, you can make changes faster and easier than having to go through the entire publishing workflow. I want to make this point very strongly. Any one of you who have ArcGIS Server 10.1 or higher installations, whether they're standalone servers or already federated with a portal, any one of you can upgrade to 10.5 today. Sir, with the 9X and the 10.0s down here in front, we'll have to talk a little bit more. Every other person in here who raised your hand with 10.1 or higher can upgrade to 10.5 today, and I strongly encourage you to do so. What I want you to keep in mind is that while you can, of course, upgrade your standalone server to 10.5, longer term, over the next couple of years, you should look very strongly into moving to the full ArcGIS Enterprise product, which means having the base deployment in place. That's not just the server, that's also the portal, the data stores, and so forth. One reason for that is virtually all of the new functionality that we're building builds on top of that baseline infrastructure. A great example of that is GeoAnalytics Server. GeoAnalytics Server requires the base deployment in place before you can add it. But let's talk about what GeoAnalytics actually is. ArcGIS with GeoAnalytics Server has gained a new way to process massive amounts of vector and tabular data using fast distributed computing technologies, as well as storage mechanisms that can deal with large volumes of data. Fundamentally, it's about being able to go from noise, a bunch of blue dots on a map, doesn't really make out much. As it happens, this is New York City taxi cab data. You've probably seen it in previous presentations. By itself, this doesn't tell you anything. There's 110 million points all drawn on top of each other, and it's just a blob. Going from this to intelligence can be as simple as doing an aggregation into, for example, polygons like this. And just by this simple act of taking points and aggregating the counts into polygons, we can start gaining very valuable insight. This may be the end of the analysis. You can put this into a story map and start making great explanations about, well, there's a lot of taxi cab pickups at airports and around Central Park. That may or may not be great insight. But you can also take this and continue your analysis within ArcGIS Desktop, ArcMap, or Pro. But of course, also take this and put it into your applications. Do this analysis directly in your custom apps and continue using all of the rest of our geoprocessing tools, all 700 or 800 plus. I've lost count. So GeoAnalytics is not about replacing anything in the ArcGIS platform. It's about adding to that entire set of GP tools that we have had for a long time, taking a core set of those tools. We've rewritten them to be much more efficient on modern distributed hardware. And of course, all of this is part of an ecosystem within the ArcGIS platform. So once you finish your processing, there's no ETL to now take data out of a system where you performed your analysis, massage it into a new format, and go through some cumbersome process to publish it out, to be able to visualize or continue your analysis. The results of your analysis is natively simply made available as a feature service. So all of your applications, as soon as the analysis is done, can take that result and plot it on a map or do whatever else you want to do with it. That is a key differentiator for GeoAnalytics compared to many other types of analytical software that's out there today. You simply don't have to go through all those additional steps. GeoAnalytics is about solving completely new problems, things we couldn't even attempt to do before because the volume of data was unmanageable or just simply took too long to be practical. It's also about taking those old problems that you may be solving today, but solving them much, much faster. If you used to have to wait weeks for an answer, now you can do it in days or maybe even hours or minutes. The demo that we showed on stage here a couple of hours ago during the plenary of taking 110 million points that had been dynamically ingested over a week and processing them into tracks in under half an hour was not something that you could reasonably do with the existing tooling. With GeoAnalytics, now we can. So GeoAnalytics comes with roughly a dozen or so tools today. When you look at your analysis workflows, the first thing to do is understanding where are my bottlenecks, and can I identify some of those bottlenecks as having matching tools within GeoAnalytics. So I can take my 12 steps and replace one or two of them to take my full processing time down to something much, much smaller than before. When you're using GeoAnalytics, you can, of course, use ArcGIS Pro. It's designed from the ground up to be a modern desktop GIS application that integrates with ArcGIS Online, ArcGIS Enterprise, and all of the advanced capabilities of ArcGIS Enterprise. You can also use the map viewer. Directly from within a browser, you can start working with these massive amounts of data. Personally, I find that a little bit disconcerting. But it shows the power of what you can also build in your custom web applications today. Because all of this is exposed through the REST API. GeoAnalytics does not mean you have to learn something completely new. Anything you have that knows how to talk to an ArcGIS geoprocessing service can also call into the GeoAnalytics tools. That means you can take a web app builder application, use the GP widget, and use GA. It means you can use any one of the APIs and SDKs to call this directly. An example of a great API that you can use on top of this is the new Python API that you saw Rohit demonstrate earlier. The Python API can be used by you as you're doing exploratory analysis. It can also be used by you as part of automated workflows, things that run on a nightly basis. Maybe it's part of a cron job that calls in and runs this kind of analysis on the back end to power the data that ultimately comes to life through your front-end applications. So why would you want to use GeoAnalytics Server as part of ArcGIS Enterprise? Well, it's applicable in a couple of different ways. One is simply to extend the power of GIS analysts working within the desktop. Lauren demonstrated that very, very vividly. Doing things within the desktop that you just couldn't do before or it took too long. I'm willing to bet that many of you work in what I consider the next category up, meaning you're building your own applications and solutions where you have even more advanced needs, like setting up those automated workflows, setting up multi-machine deployments of GeoAnalytics to crunch through huge amounts of data that may be streaming in, or you may be receiving data dumps on a regular basis that you need to crunch through. The next server role that I want to talk briefly about is image server. Image server used to be image extension, and it's what powers your image services coming from Mosaic datasets. Image server has the ability to make those images accessible to the rest of your organization through your applications, through maps, performing on-the-fly processing, applying all kinds of different raster functions and raster models directly on the data just in time. New at Image Server 10.5 as part of ArcGIS Enterprise is raster analytics, and you saw Vinay demonstrate that this morning. It's the logical parallel in the raster and imagery world to GeoAnalytics. This is about being able to process large amounts of pixels, whether that's coming from large geographies or high-resolution images, or simply large collections of images. And performing that processing at source resolution, creating new persisted output on disk. So Image Server has those two dual roles. It mirrors the GIS server in its ability to connect out to your data sources, whether those are files on disk, files in the cloud. New at Image Server at 10.5 is the ability to connect to S3 storage if you're running in Amazon, or Azure storage if you're running within Microsoft Azure. So those terabytes worth of images can now be stored in cheap, reliable, well, I guess Amazon did have an issue recently. Cheap, reliable cloud storage, and still be consumed and visualized directly within the product. New, though, is raster analytics and the ability to run those raster processing chains, the raster functions that you know from image extension on desktop, as well as image extension in server from previous releases. And just like GeoAnalytics, it doesn't replace anything inside of the ArcGIS platform. It adds to, takes all of those existing function chains and functions, adds new powerful analytics, the ability for you to write your own custom raster functions using Python. Being able to run that, again, within a distributed computing environment that can scale up to 200 cores, as you saw Vinay do earlier today, or simply running on multiple machines within your infrastructure at a much smaller scale, but ultimately be able to take all of your data and process it faster than you ever could before. And again, of course, the result is immediately accessible as just a new image service. Without you having to explicitly publish anything, the result is written out in the raster store of your choice and made available as a new image service directly from there. So like I said, large amounts of rasters, or rather large amounts of pixels, can be because you have, for a large area, you have high resolution for a small area, or maybe you simply have many, many rasters. And again, going from something that may have taken months or weeks in the past and doing your processing in days, hours, and in some cases even minutes. Now that's a lot about the capabilities of ArcGIS Enterprise and the related servers. I want to take a quick step back and talk about the evolutions of GIS. Whenever we talk about an evolution in GIS, there's a tendency to think that what new thing we're talking about completely replaces the old thing. And I don't think that that's true. 10 years or more ago, when we started really talking about server GIS, maybe we didn't quite call it that, but ArcIMS and ArcGIS Server in the early versions represented this idea of web-based services, web services as we know them today. First it was XML, then it was SOAP, still XML. Then we got REST and JSON, but ultimately it was about direct client to a web server. That didn't replace desktop GIS. Desktop GIS was as important as ever. In fact, I would argue it is much more important, because where did all those web services come from? They came from data that was generated on the desktop, and the services were defined, authored within the desktop. When we start talking about WebGIS, and we started doing that a few years ago, that was not about replacing server GIS. That was about recognizing that as powerful as server GIS is, we want to make it even more powerful, and we want to make it even easier for you, both as users, but certainly also as developers. Many of you told us that you had to reinvent the same things over and over again, create the same frameworks for every new application, and you wanted us to help take some of that pain away. That is, from a developer's perspective, fundamentally what WebGIS is all about. Providing that common abstraction layer, the application infrastructure, so we can all work on the same platform instead of fighting to build the same things in 5, 10 different ways. And now when we're talking about distributed GIS, that's again not replacing the WebGIS idea, the pattern. That's about acknowledging that many of these systems do now start talking to each other. Whether that's within a single organization that's geographically spread out, or simply because of the political structure of such an organization. In many cases, it's also different organizations, entities that want to collaborate and exchange data and information quickly and easily. When we look at the evolution of different web and distributed GIS patterns, there's 4 that I want to highlight and talk a bit about here today. There's, on the upper side, ArcGIS Online, the SaaS model. On the lower half, there's ArcGIS Enterprise, running within your infrastructure, wherever that infrastructure may be. And when we look at it from the left-hand side first, there's the simple way to get started with all of this, and that's simply using ArcGIS Online. There's no software to install. You connect directly up to services that we've already made available. You put your own content in, create new services, and you're up and going. Many of you used a pattern over the past several years, affectionately known as the hybrid pattern. Combining your existing ArcGIS server, the standalone server, with ArcGIS Online, registering your map services and feature services, and then consuming them through web maps and layers. Looking at it from the other side, there's the traditional ArcGIS server running behind the firewall. Over the past couple of years, what we've seen there is the addition of the portal. This is still running entirely within that firewall, disconnected in this case from the open internet. There can be many reasons for why that's the case, whether it's regulatory, simply the nature of the data that you work with, or the organization's mission in life. Many of you, though, may be running the software within your own infrastructure behind your firewall, but you still have the ability to opportunistically reach out to the open internet, augmenting your own data with not necessarily just base maps, although that's by far the most common use, but also making use of services coming from, for example, ArcGIS Online. If you don't have your own world routing service, and most organizations don't, you can simply reach out to the world routing service made available from ArcGIS Online. And within ArcGIS Enterprise, we make it really easy to do that without you necessarily having to know anything about what's going on the back end. And then increasingly, and this is what Jack was talking about this morning with distributed GIS, is this idea that even a single organization can be using both ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise, using both systems when they make sense. Maybe you have data that needs to stay within your own infrastructure. Again, there can be regulatory reasons or simply company policies. But that data that does need to go out to the general public can be made available through online, so you don't have to scale for it. You don't have to install more software, more infrastructure. Or maybe you need to simply collaborate with third-party vendors, somebody who doesn't have an account on your domain. You're not giving them VPN access. ArcGIS Online can be a very convenient way to get data from those kinds of partners and then bring that data back down within your own systems. This is the vision of what we're building towards with the collaboration technology that you saw Shreya's demo during the plenary this morning. With 10.5, we have the ability to set up multiple ArcGIS Enterprise deployments and have them collaborate with each other. Here in just a few months, when we release ArcGIS Enterprise 10.5.1, that just rolls off the tongue, and an update to ArcGIS Online, we will also have the ability to make this pattern really come to life without you having to custom script and run things on a nightly basis to copy data back and forth. That collaboration will be built into the two products. What I really want to have you all understand is that making a choice between online and enterprise doesn't have to be an either or. In many cases, we're seeing that being a both. The other point that I want you to take away from this is the idea that those standalone servers will over time have to be moved towards the ArcGIS Enterprise setup, meaning the base deployment. The 3 examples on the right-hand side with the server plus the portal, that is essentially what we are now referring to as ArcGIS Enterprise. If you're using the standalone server with ArcGIS Online, the classic hybrid model, you need to be aware of some of the changes that are happening with new functionality coming into ArcGIS Enterprise, whether that's GeoAnalytics or raster analytics, but also the ability to publish from ArcGIS Pro relies on the base deployment being in place. So why is it, again, we're making this transition from server GIS to WebGIS? What is it that we find so compelling? I'm curious to hear if you agree with my characterization of this. But if we look at the server GIS pattern, what often happened was we had an idea that somebody came in with a set of requirements. We build an application, publish the necessary services underneath, and then we'll be able to reuse those services in another application somewhere else. So we do that. But then Steve Jobs comes around and says, no Flash on iPads. And we all collectively groaned. And then we built a new application for that iPad. But as it turns out, it had a different form factor, and it needed slightly different data or slightly different look and feel, so we published a new set of services. And then somebody came around and said, well, I actually also need it on that Android phone. And we did the whole thing over and over again. While this was certainly not always the case, it was the case often enough that this was a big pain for developing applications. How do we make it so we can reuse more of those underlying services across our full suite of applications that we're building? That's the idea of what we're trying to do with WebGIS. Getting that common application infrastructure in place so those services are now abstracted out through the portal, which provides the identity and access control that we need, but also makes all of those services available as layers through web maps that all of our applications built on top of the Esri APIs and SDKs know and understand. You create a web map, whether in the map viewer itself, in the portal, or through Pro, or through some other mechanism, that web map can be drawn with full fidelity no matter what application you're using, on what device you're using it. So now we can build that full range of applications. All of the apps that we're creating, such as Collector, Explorer, Operations Dashboard, and all of the applications that you're developing as business partners and developers within your own organizations, all building on top of that same framework, sharing the same layers and maps, so we can meet all of the user requirements without you having to build the same things over and over again. Within the WebGIS pattern is this concept of named users, members of your portal organization. New at 10.5 is the introduction of a new level of named user, based in large part on feedback from business partners and developers such as yourselves. With 10.5, we now have a level 1 named user, which is a viewer. Somebody has the ability to view content created, authored by somebody else, but doesn't have to create content of their own. This describes many of the users of the applications that you build. So this viewer can view content, including maps, the applications you build, and other data types. They cannot create or own content within the system. The named user that we've had in previous releases is now known as the level 2 named user. So this is the full-fledged named user that itself can be assigned to any number of different user roles, whether that's a publisher, administrator, or your custom roles. Ultimately, those users can do anything that they have been granted privileges to within the system. So you as an administrator of the system have a very fine-grained privilege model by which you can assign certain rights and abilities to your users. Now I want to go back and talk a bit more about the base deployment. As we talk about the base deployment, there are the 4 components. So what make up those 4 components? Well, there's ArcGIS Server itself. That's the software you install. In the base deployment, it's licensed with the GIS Server role. This is what's known and set up as the hosting server, if you're familiar with the terms of ArcGIS Server and portal today. So it serves as the place in the system where all of the data that you hand over to the system is made available as web services. It's also where you can publish your own map and feature services and so forth too from ArcMap or ArcGIS Pro. Portal for ArcGIS serves 2 different purposes within the base deployment. What it's probably most well known for is that web front end. A lot of users go to the portal as their landing page. That's where they log in, that's where they can create their own maps, that's where they can search and discover the content and the applications that you've created. But it's also the component that provides that application infrastructure that you're building on top of. The portal itself has a REST API that powers everything else that we do. This is where you send your OAuth requests. This is what integrates with all your different security user and group systems. ArcGIS Data Store, like I mentioned, is where we place data that is handed over to the system. This is not a replacement for the enterprise geodatabase. I want to repeat that. It is not a replacement for traditional enterprise geodatabases. But when somebody hands over a CSV file by dragging and dropping it onto the map viewer and saying, yes, make a feature service out of that, the data has to go somewhere. That somewhere is the ArcGIS Data Store. In this case, it goes into what's known as the relational data store. When you publish your own multi-patch data and create a scene layer, 3D, we create a tile cache out of that. But instead of creating files on disk, as with traditional raster tile caches, we put that into a NoSQL data store. That's what the tile cache data store represents here. When we set up GeoEvent to ingest all of that flight data you saw earlier, we need to be able to write it at high volume to a known quantity. That's not a traditional RDBMS. We're not writing thousands of events per second to SQL Server or Oracle or Postgres or anything else like that. We need something different. That's what the spatiotemporal data store represents for us. Likewise, GeoAnalytics has the ability to read data from both the relational and the spatiotemporal data stores, but it also writes back to them. So those results, like I said, they're automatically services. That means we need a place to store those results that can be exposed as web services. Again, that's what the relational and the spatiotemporal data stores represent within the ArcGIS Enterprise system. Finally, the ArcGIS Web Adapter is both a simple software load balancer. It's what makes it possible for us to set up HA environments within your own infrastructure without necessarily requiring expensive F5 hardware load balancers or anything else similar to it. It's also the component that allows us to integrate into your security infrastructure, capturing web tier authentication, whether it's IWA, PKI, or things of that nature. All of these components have a place within the system itself. And when you combine them up in a specific way, that's what gives you the base ArcGIS Enterprise deployment and the ability to do everything we talked about. Now, in a 1-hour session, there's no way that I can cover everything in detail. So I want to make a plug for several other sessions that we have here this week. Right after this session at 2:30, we have a session called Administering Your ArcGIS Portal. This goes into more of the administrative aspects of managing an ArcGIS online organization or simply Portal for ArcGIS as part of ArcGIS Enterprise. If you want more of a Delta story, what's new within ArcGIS Enterprise, come back here at 4 o'clock. Shannon will be there, I will be there. We'll have some of our colleagues doing demos. It's going to be much more technical, mechanical with demos showing new features. Less slides. On Thursday, I'm doing a session on architecting your ArcGIS Enterprise deployment. I said you could install it on one machine, many machines. Well, when should you? When do I need to scale out? When I'm looking at something like GeoAnalytics or Image Server, do I need one machine? Do I need multiple machines? What can I do? We'll get into all of that. And then late on Thursday, if you want to know what's ahead for ArcGIS Enterprise, come to the Road Ahead session. With that, I want to open it up for questions before too many of you leave. Over here.
So my understanding is that ArcGIS for desktop is stopping at 10.5 as far as scalability, and obviously server and now enterprise has kind of gone up with that. Is it going to continue to be like 2.6 or 10.6 enterprise, 10.7? Is it going to be 11? How is that?
There are multiple good questions there. One was that ArcGIS for desktop, you don't have to say 4 anymore. It's OK. I assume you mean ArcMap. So ArcMap, like Jim talked about a little bit, is essentially not where we're putting our development efforts, right? Our development efforts on the desktop are going into ArcGIS Pro. ArcMap is still fully supported and will continue releasing for a while. You can use both ArcMap and Pro with ArcGIS Enterprise. Right? You can publish map services from ArcMap to ArcGIS Enterprise 10.5 and the upcoming 10.6, just like you always have. Pro has gained a lot of capabilities in that area over the past few releases. The other part of the question was, well, what will we call our next releases? I'll let you know as soon as we know. We are planning a 10.5.1, I mentioned that much. That's actually coming out here in a few months. So we're not resting on our laurels from 10.5. 10.6 is tentatively planned for the end of the year, subject to change. After 10.6, we'll let you know. I'm going to go out on a limb and say there will be a 10.6.1. Okay. Other questions? Anybody who's moving from server-style GIS or to WebGIS or others?
Are the roles mutually exclusive? You can only take on one role at a time.
Great question. So the question is, can I combine multiple server roles on a single machine? I install the ArcGIS Server software component, and then can I apply both a GIS server role and, let's say, an image server role? The technical answer is yes, you can combine them. The longer answer is you need to be careful, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Specifically, GeoAnalytics Server is by its very nature designed to use up every single resource on the machine. All the CPU, all the memory it can possibly get its hands on. Don't combine that with any other role, or your map services will be awfully slow all of a sudden. GeoEvent also has some of that going for it. Depending on the volume of data streaming into the system, GeoEvent is probably not something you want to combine with anything else. Image and GIS server, it depends what you're using it for. If you're doing raster analytics, just like GeoAnalytics, that will suck up all the resources on the machine by design. So don't combine that. That's my long way of saying no, please don't, or be really careful and know what you're doing before you start going down that path. That goes into the architecting session on Thursday. All right. Thank you so much for coming. There's another question over here. We'll do one more, and then we'll take more questions up here.
My question was, Image Server used to be a standalone thing, and then it became a plug-in to ArcGIS Server. Is it now another standalone thing, or is it still integrated with ArcGIS Server?
So I'll paraphrase this. Image Server, simply part of ArcGIS Server. Yes, there's the one software component called ArcGIS Server. When you apply the Image Server license to it, That's what ArcGIS Server now does. It has the ability to publish out those dynamic image services of mosaic data sets, has the ability to perform raster analysis. What it can't do in that case is publish map services because it's not a GIS server. Right? That's where the server roles come in.
It's not
But it's
licensed
still the base ArcGIS server install, and then you apply the image server license.
It's just a licensing mechanism, yes. Right. Thank you, everybody.